Hi, this is Mr. Guy, and we're going to be going over the reserve requirement. And the reserve requirement is one of the tools of monetary policy that we're going to be using. And this is one of the tools we're going to use to increase or decrease GDP depending on what our goals are and what we want to do. So if we're in a recession, we want to basically use the reserve requirement to make the economy better. If we have a lot of inflation and high prices and we have a lot of debt, we might want to decrease the economy. So we want to change the reserve requirement to slow it down. The reserve requirement is the percent of money that banks must hold in reserve for withdrawals and cash use. This money can't be used to make loans. It has to sit in the vaults and used to give out cash to people, and it can't be used for loans. If we increase the reserve requirement, that reduces the amount of money banks can lend, which is not good for them. So they lend less money, and people borrow less money, and then there's less consumer spending, and then GDP would go down. A decrease in the reserve requirement increases the amount of money that banks can lend. So banks can lend more money, they'll give it out to more people, and then people will then take the loans and then spend the money and then increase in GDP. So basically it depends on what your goal is. If you want to increase or decrease GDP, what you do with the reserve requirement. So this is the formula, S equals A1 over R, and basically what we're trying to do is increase the money supply. So if we increase the money supply, that means we're going to increase the amount of loans. If we increase the amount of loans, we increase the borrowing and then the spending and then GDP. S is the potential increase in money supply. That's what we're trying to make go up or down by 1%, 2%, or 3%, or whatever you decide. A1 is the initial deposit, and that's actually the amount that the government borrows. And we can find that or we can calculate it. And then R is the reserve requirement that we can get on the Federal Reserve website. The money supply number that we want to use is always M2, money supply, not M1. And if we increase M2 by a certain percent, then GDP will go up by a certain percent. So here's an example. And I basically have 5 steps. So I basically, if you're trying to solve it and use it in your speech, you take step 1 is write out the formula, S equals A1 over R. Step 2 is basically define each thing. S is the potential increase in money supply. A1 is the initial deposit. R is the reserve requirement. Step 3 is find out what it is today. So I just made up a hypothetical, but in your speech you would find what is the reserve requirement, what's the money supply, what's the initial deposit. But I just put S equals 100 over 0.10 equals 1,000. So the money supply today is 1,000, and we want to increase it. So we lower the reserve requirement from 10% to 5%. 100 stays the same, and then the money supply goes from 1,000 to 2,000. And then we did our job. We lowered the reserve requirement. We increased the money supply. So therefore, by decreasing the reserve requirement from 10% to 5%, the money supply will increase from 1,000 to 2,000, making borrowing easy, consumers spend more, businesses expand, employment increase, and consumers spend more. And this is kind of like what we wanted to do, and this is our goal. So to summarize, to increase GDP or lower unemployment, one would lower the reserve requirement, and then the money supply will increase. If the money supply increases 1%, GDP will increase 1%, and that's the relationship that holds. If you decrease the money supply 5%, GDP will go down 5%. So if we want to increase or decrease the money supply, this does affect C, or consumer spending, and then affecting GDP. So it basically works where we change the money supply, it affects borrowing, it affects consumer spending, then it affects GDP. So the money supply then goes to the amount of borrowing, then it goes into C, and then GDP. So if your goal is to increase GDP 2%, then use the reserve requirement. Lower it using the formula, so the money supply will increase exactly 2%, and then we increase C by 2%, and then GDP will go up 2%. Over the last 100 years, the relationship between the money supply and GDP is held. The money supply that is used is M2, not M1. So we're going to be doing all the different tools for monetary policy. This is the first tool. It's one of the easiest ones. You can use this in your speech. It'll be probably on a quiz next week. So make sure that you understand it. Ask questions, but just remember, if you want to increase the money supply, you would lower the reserve requirement. If you want to decrease the money supply, you'd raise the reserve requirement. We'll go through the numbers and we'll go through the formulas and everything in class. If you have any questions, please ask. Thanks a lot. Have a good night.